Okay, so continuing with disaster response plans on page 384. So disaster response can be either chaotic or orderly, and the difference really is between these established procedures and responsibilities or not, right? So we want to focus on three main goals in this area. Safety of employees, it seems to be forgotten by some IT people at times. Minimizing damage and evaluating the situation in the next steps, right? So this response plan should define the organizational structure, the roles, the responsibilities, and even designate command, control, communications, and alternate work sites. Okay, so for command and control, as soon as the disaster is declared and the board is activated, the BCP, all of these members should report to a command and control center. Sometimes it's called a war room or something. It's just a co-located place where everybody gathers. And then we want to communicate, right? The organization should have an Occupant Emergency Plan, or OEP, right? It's going to describe the evacuation or shelter in place, etc. We want to have relocation strategies, right? That both deliver for delivery and operational business functions. So delivery functions provide service to the actual customer, and operational business functions are like accounting, marketing, office services, security, and IT, right? So these are some of the things that we want to do. In addition to that, you want to define some sites. So there's a hot site, which means it's fully operational, ready to go with redundant software, hardware, and data. It's replicated and it's real time. Very expensive, but doable. Depends on the need. A warm site is partially equipped, and so the computers will need to be configured and data will need to be sent over or restored. A cold site is a backup facility. It's got power and HVAC and secure access, but there's really no staged equipment. It's going to take longer, but it's cheaper. And a mobile site, these are like a third-party site where data, you'd only really need to restore the data, but you're paying a third party to maintain this capability. In St. Louis, for example, Worldwide Technologies is a company that maintains a hot site for various other companies around. And there's a good policy example on page 386 of the book. Okay, so operational contingency plans then are going to address as part of the BCP how the organization's essential business processes are going to be delivered, right? Like financial institutions, they're offering its customers maybe the option of banking services during the pandemic, where that is not a primary service that they offer otherwise, right? Operational contingency plans are developed at the departmental level, right, and funneled up through the chain, and they are the responsibility of the business owner. Remember, we talked the owners and others before, custodians, so keep that in mind. So operational contingency operating procedures, when we write them, we want to use short, direct sentences. These are, remember, procedures now. So in the hierarchy, when I say words like procedures, policies, controls, I want you to think of the hierarchy that we talked about in the first week when it comes to in terms of policy itself. And that would be operational contingency plans. But then afterwards, we have this recovery time period, right? And the recovery phase, this is where the organization is going to begin to process restoring or replacing damaged infrastructure. That can be, this can range from immediate failover of a server, right? When one antivirus server goes down, it fails over to the next, for example. And there, you should set priorities for recovery operations, and they should be consistent with the higher or overarching business impact analysis that we did, BIA. So we want to develop these recovery plans and break the plans down into levels, whatever levels you want to use, right, based on stakeholder risk assessment. But some good categories would be the mainframe, the network, communications, infrastructure, and the facilities. You can see that discussed on page 389. In addition, we're going to have recovery procedures, right? And these items should be addressed before the event happens, right? And we want to explain the logical progression. I really think table 12.4, which shows a recovery procedure for an Active Directory domain controller, I really think that's a very good example on page 389 to page 390. Notice they start with support phone numbers right away, right? Because one of the first things I ask in any contingency when something goes down, did we contact the vendor, right? So you want to have that information readily handy. Then it discusses general information about the Active Directory domain controllers. For example, it provides authentication, DNS, and DHCP services, right? So we can get our IP addresses, that sort of thing. And if a domain controller fails, the remaining domain controllers will be able to authenticate, provide DNS resolution, and assign dynamic addresses, right? So you have that. On the next page, it shows the detail then of where the domain controllers are at in excruciating detail, and the recovery and resumption operations. It's really very good and worth your time to pause and just look through that. So the resumption phase has, we want to transition to that as a way of transitioning back to normal operations. And so there are two main activities, and one is validation and the other is deactivation, identified and addressed here. And also on page 391 of the book. You also want to plan and test maintenance, right? So the BCP should be maintained in a state of readiness, which is very important. It never goes idle, right? Always. And you want to test it. There are three main ways to testing: a tabletop, a functional exercise, and a full-scale exercise. I've done many tabletops and led them, in fact. And you want to assess at what level do you want leadership involved. Do you want the whole company involved? I worked for a Fortune 80 company that senior leadership hesitated to be involved, and you almost had to hold their hand. And that's okay. That's not what they do day to day. I don't mind an exercise that guides them through the questions to ask because they know what the business needs from a value perspective, right? So various levels of participation and activity based on the types of plans that you are running, okay? I've even done a simulation, which is great. You want to be careful, for example, when you want to run an exercise simulation. How are you going to communicate, right? How do you ensure that the information doesn't get out or get leaked, or somebody accidentally executes an activity because they think the event is real, right? Every conversation, every email subject should be predicated with exercise, 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 for example. That sort of thing. So you want to be very careful, but you still want to test it in these fashions: tabletop, functional, or even full scale. You can pay vendors to come in and do that for you. That pretty much wraps up chapter 12, and we'll move to chapter 13 next. Thanks.